who facilitated those abusive practices. I want to start by talking about this request that we filed in 2003 and the reasons why we filed the request. When we filed this request in October of 2003, there was almost no information in the public domain about the treatment of prisoners in U.S. custody. There had been a couple of newspaper articles, one written by Bart Gellman and Dana Priest for the Washington Post, and that's the one that Shaquille was quoting just now. There was another one that was written by Carlotta Gall in the New York Times about 2 prisoners who died in Afghanistan in U.S. custody. And we thought that there was enough information in the public domain to begin asking questions about whether this kind of abuse was aberrational or whether it was a matter of official practice and official policy. So we filed a request, a 3-page Freedom of Information Act request with the Defense Department, the CIA, the Justice Department, the State Department, asking them for any information that they had in their custody about the treatment and interrogation of prisoners. And that request was ignored by all of the agencies. In April of 2004, the Abu Ghraib photographs were broadcast by CBS News. And it became clear to everybody that there was something that had gone horribly wrong in at least that detention center. We went into court in August of 2004 asking the judge to enforce the FOIA request, the Freedom of Information Act request that we had filed 9 months earlier. And I think that because of the Abu Ghraib photographs, the judge was on our side. The judge saw those photographs and he thought, there is something wrong here. Somebody has to account for what happened. And the judge ordered the government to start processing our request. And processing in this context means searching for documents that are responsive to the request, going through them to see if they can be released to the public, and then if the government decides that they can't be released to the public, explaining why they can't be released. So that process began only after a judge ordered these agencies to start doing that in August of 2004. The first set of documents we got was a set of FBI emails. FBI agents had been stationed at Guantanamo in late 2000. Well, they'd been stationed there beginning in late 2001, but starting in 2002, FBI agents at Guantanamo began to exchange emails about the treatment of prisoners held at that facility. And the FBI agents said in these emails that they had seen Defense Department military interrogators using techniques that the FBI agents thought were abusive, ineffective, and in some cases counterproductive. The techniques themselves are fairly horrific. They're the kinds of techniques that have been used against U.S. personnel in previous conflicts by governments that don't abide by the Geneva Conventions. So, for example, prisoners are shackled in excruciating stress positions. They're called positions that seem innocuous, but become very, very painful if you're forced to stay in that position for any more than a few minutes. In some cases, the prisoners had been stripped naked. They had been hooded for long periods of time. They had been held in isolation, in one case for 3 months. And if you hold a human being in isolation for 3 months, that human being goes crazy. And the FBI agents had seen this happen to one of the prisoners, and they were exchanging emails in which they were talking about these abusive methods that were being used by the military interrogators. And the remarkable thing about these emails, we had suspected, because of the few news stories that had come out, we had suspected even before this that there was something systemic about the abuse that was taking place. But these were FBI agents who were describing the abuse. And people don't believe ACLU attorneys when they say their clients told them that prisoners that they had been tortured at Guantanamo. There are a lot of Americans who are skeptical of defense attorneys, skeptical of ACLU lawyers, but who aren't skeptical of FBI agents. And when the FBI agents described what was going on at Guantanamo, people started to pay attention. So that was the first set of documents we got. And I think that was the first set of documents that really made clear that what had taken place at Abu Ghraib wasn't isolated, that wasn't the only place where these kinds of abuses had taken place. The same kinds of things were happening at Guantanamo. The second set of documents we got were the first of the Office of Legal Counsel memos. These are memos. So the Office of Legal Counsel was part of the Justice Department. And in the past, it's been called the conscience of the executive branch, because the Office of Legal Counsel is supposed to tell the executive branch when something they're doing violates the law. The Office of Legal Counsel has the authority to tell the rest of the executive branch what the law is, and the rest of the executive branch has to pay attention. So in the past, the Office of Legal Counsel has played has played the role of looking over the shoulder of the executive branch to make sure that what they're doing is defensible and legal. But under the Bush administration, the Office of Legal Counsel became involved in facilitating the unlawful activities of the rest of the executive branch. And one thing that the Office of Legal Counsel did was draft these legal memos, which now are called the torture memos, that essentially allow interrogators to use methods that the United States previously prosecuted as war crimes. And those methods include, the most notorious one is waterboarding. After World War II and after the Korean War, the United States prosecuted enemy interrogators who had subjected U.S. personnel to waterboarding. They prosecuted them for war crimes, and those people were sentenced to long sentences for their commission of war crimes. Now, the Office of Legal Counsel was telling U.S. interrogators that they could use precisely those methods against prisoners in their custody. And I think that's the first time it became clear that the abuses that had taken place at Abu Ghraib and the abuses that had taken place at Guantanamo weren't the result of rogue interrogators or interrogators who had been left to their own devices. Those techniques and those abuses were the result of decisions made at the very top, decisions that had been thought through by senior officials in the Bush administration and decisions that had been justified by lawyers in the Justice Department. The third set of documents that we got were interrogation directives signed by senior military and civilian officials. We got an interrogation directive signed by Secretary Rumsfeld, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. It was dated December of 2002. It's one of the documents in my book. And it's got a long list of interrogation methods, some of which had never been used before by U.S. personnel. Some of which constituted war crimes under international law. And at the bottom, there's a signature, Donald Rumsfeld's signature on this document. So you'll remember, after April of 2004, when the photos came out, when the Abu Ghraib photos came out, President Bush went on national TV and Donald Rumsfeld went on national TV to say that these are really horrific abuses. But these abuses were aberrational. They were the result of a few bad apples, of rogue soldiers. And the people who perpetrated these abuses will be held responsible. That was the party line. That was the line they took. And all that time, there was this interrogation directive that Secretary Rumsfeld had signed that listed and authorized many of the methods that were depicted in those photographs, many of the interrogation methods that had been captured in those photographs. So again, more evidence that the abuses were approved at the top. Another set of documents that we got was a set of autopsy reports. When the Abu Ghraib photos came out, another thing that the administration said is that these abuses were the worst of it. There are always abuses in wartime. That was their line. There are always abuses in wartime. These are the worst of it. It's unfortunate they were captured on film, but we're going to hold those people accountable. At that time, when they were presenting to the country that this was the worst of it, there were already 24 autopsies in which Army medical personnel had concluded that the deaths were the result of homicides. Some of those autopsy reports are in the book as well. But I think that many Americans, most Americans, think that even if Abu Ghraib wasn't isolated, even if those abuses were pervasive, the abuses were limited to things like shackling, stress positions, to things like hooding, stripping prisoners naked. In fact, some of the abuses went much, much further than that. There are well over 100 deaths that are documented in these autopsy reports. 30 of those deaths involve deaths during interrogations. So in some of those cases, prisoners were beaten to death.